It all happened after a suicide attempt where I was hospitalized and put on a psychiatric hold. It was after over a decade of suicidal ideation.
Caitlin Ner is the Director of Operations at PsyMed Ventures, helping to invest into the next wave of mental and brain health technologies. However, interestingly, Caitlin's career actually started off doing global infrastructure investment at BlackRock. And this comes after she studied economics and computer science at Harvard University.
The catalyst that led to that career transition, it really stemmed from one of the lowest parts of my life.
Welcome to Low to Grow, the podcast transforming life's toughest moments into opportunity for growth. I'm Annie, a Forbes Under 30 technology founder whose entrepreneurship journey ran parallel to a mental health awakening. In every episode, I sit down with inspiring individuals and delve into how they managed to turn their personal or professional challenges into opportunities for growth. If you're facing uncertainty in your life, feeling down, or simply need a kick of inspiration to keep moving forward, this is your space for the honest and uplifting conversations that you will want to hear. Hit follow so you never miss an episode, and let's dive in. Today, I am delighted to introduce someone who has worn more hats in her career than most people try on in a lifetime. Caitlin Ner is the Director of Operations at PsyMed Ventures, where she is helping to invest into the next wave of mental and brain health technologies. Before that, she scaled growth and operations at Cerebral, which is a mental health startup tackling access to mental health. However, interestingly, Caitlin's career actually started off doing global infrastructure investment at BlackRock, and this comes after she studied economics and computer science at Harvard University. She is also now doing a master's in applied neuroscience at King's College London. And to me, Caitlin is a living example of what it looks like to build a career that's not just impressive on paper, but also deeply mission-driven. Caitlin, welcome to the Low to Grow podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Well, Caitlin, who do you think will benefit the most from listening to our conversation today?
So I think anyone who feels like they're behind in life when they really aren't, anyone who is navigating their sense of self in this chaotic world, and anyone who is tackling a mental illness in their career.
Right. Let's just dive in then. You studied at Harvard and then went on to work at BlackRock before transitioning into the more mental health aspect of your career. Could you tell me a bit more about how that transition happened?
Yeah, so, I started my career in infrastructure, and it really started because I was interested in both having investing experience, but also having impact experience. With infrastructure, I was able to invest in a lot of socially impactful causes like renewable energy, airports, and more. It was a great starting point for my career, but I quickly learned it was essentially during the pandemic that it wasn't where I wanted to be. I started working on deals and reading a lot of engineering reports and operating reports and kind of losing alignment with what I wanted to do and where I was at.
How did you move from investment into mental health?
The catalyst that led to that career transition, it really stemmed from one of the lowest parts of my life. It all happened after a suicide attempt where I was hospitalized and put on a psychiatric hold. Now, a lot led up to that. It was after over a decade of suicidal ideation, a really stressful work environment in the COVID-19 pandemic. I was an investor at a large infrastructure fund over at BlackRock. It was a multi-trillion-dollar fund. I invested in assets like renewable energy, toll roads, airports. And during the pandemic, I moved out of my New York apartment and actually moved back in with my parents. I was really lucky to have a very safe family environment. But like many others, I was socially isolated away from people my age for nearly a year. That isolation coupled with extremely long working hours, working on multiple deals, it really led to chronic stress. And I started to fall behind even on work. I started to feel like my technical skills weren't building as fast as possible, and we were understaffed at work. That stress turned into what I thought was depression. So I asked my doctor to prescribe me with SSRI medication. And that really didn't help the symptoms at all. Now, around spring 2021, I was also very active on Twitter and affiliated with an entrepreneurial community called Launch House. It was a Series A16Z backed startup. It hosted a lot of events and programming for early stage founders. And during that time, I was actually invited to a weekend hackathon in this multi-million-dollar mansion. Now, imagine, almost a year of isolation and then suddenly being put in this environment with passionate entrepreneurs building exciting products, suddenly in this flashy environment. It felt like I was on top of the world. I felt like I had a switch. I was so energized. I loved what I was working on during the hackathon. I met so many incredible people, but I was also messaging hundreds of people offline. I later learned that this was an episode of mania. I was not sleeping at all, 0 hours per night for 4 days straight, running 15 miles per day. And, with this manic high came an eventual crash. Like I mentioned, the suicide attempt. There, I learned that I had a mental illness called Bipolar 1, which many people know to have manic highs and depressive lows, but also symptoms like psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, and also suicidal thinking. That hospitalization really made me have that mental shift away from the traditional finance world into the mental health startup world.
Hmm. Wow, that's a really profound life experience, Caitlin, and also evidently a very difficult one for you to have gone through and come out of. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm quite curious to understand in the build up that led to this crash, how many months do you think that all of this had been festering within you?
I think the evident depression was maybe around 6 or 7 months. When we first transitioned to remote work, it was very flexible. I was continuing to work on, but I started to experience lower energy. It was very difficult to get out of bed, difficult to write emails while I actually had to work on these really intensive deals with my team at work. But I would push on even if I felt low energy because of the expectations to go to work, to perform at my best, and to continue on. I always told myself that everyone was stressed during this time. It was a pandemic. There was a lot of uncertainty. There were a lot of people that were ill. And I always compared myself to the broader environment that everyone was experiencing this. So I think that's what also prevented me from getting more holistic care is because I thought I was just one of many instead of really paying attention to getting more adequate care to understand what was happening to me.
Did anyone around you notice the change in you or suggest for you to get help, whether it's a family, friend, or a colleague?
Yeah, so I'm very lucky that I was living with my parents. They noticed that there was that change. I was very different when I was speaking at home outside of work. I was definitely not as energized to even perform in my job or to talk about hobbies or anything outside of work. That's what initially pushed me to get the depression medication. And I think that was the education piece. I did not know what bipolar was. I have heard of depression. It was evident that I had symptoms of depression. So I just thought, okay, let me get on medication to prevent this. But of course, the medication for an illness like depression is very different than bipolar disorder.
Did you speak to anyone about how you were feeling in that period that led to the 4 days of mania?
At that point, I didn't have a professional like a therapist to really dive into it. Like I would briefly say that I was stressed to my family, but I didn't go down into the details. you know, Stress is common in very high pressure jobs. So I thought that it was just the norm. So I didn't dig into why I was feeling that way. I didn't dig into the suicidal ideation that was happening and mustering inside of me. I tried to avoid it rather than address it. And I think that's what led to some of the more major aspects of the crises is that I didn't have the right tools to address it.
Hmm. That makes sense. And I know earlier you mentioned that you were living at home with your parents and that they did notice that change in you. Can you remember how they maybe tried to point it out to you or talk about it with you in that period?
Yeah, so I always was able to eat meals with my parents, and I think that was one of the luckiest components. I had a great support system during this very stressful time. And I remember my parents starting to ask questions about, like, should you stay in this job? And it wasn't about diagnoses. It was more of, is this environment the right one for you? Maybe you should take a break. They recognized that, the job was not the best fit for me. but I had a lot of pressure to stay because it was a great title, it was a great firm. I was constantly amazed with my colleagues. They were all very intelligent. So it was very difficult to take a step to leave, but my parents immediately knew that it wasn't the best fit for me. So they were very open about that. It wasn't about you need to do something. It was more curiosity and open-endedness to try to figure out a solution together.
Understood. For you, looking back to help someone in the audience who might be in a similar position in the lead up to doing something quite drastic, are there things or signs that you wish your colleagues or your friends or family could have spotted, or maybe actions that they could have taken so that you wouldn't have had to actually, face such a drastic event in your own life?
It's very important to have psychoeducation, even if you don't have a mental illness of your own. My parents, for example, never sought out clinical care, so they didn't have the psychoeducation to recommend a therapist to me. I'd say with my colleagues, I didn't open up to them, so they saw me performing and turning in projects. So I don't think there's anything that my bosses or my colleagues could have done to prevent that because I had, that facade in the work environment. But I'd say that even if you don't have a mental illness now and you want to prepare for the opportunity to support someone else, think about what types of professionals you can refer your friends and family to. Because when you are depressed or when you are manic or you're experiencing a mental illness, it's very difficult to take the steps to get care. It's difficult enough to know who to turn to, how to pay for care, where to go for your specific illness. So if you do that preparation ahead of time, you'll be able to simply send over a resource, make it as easy as possible for that friend in need or that family member in need to start to prevent anything more major in their life.
Having had the experiences that you have had, if you could go back, what would you advise your younger self to do differently?
I'd say that I would advise my younger self to not avoid difficult conversations. When I was growing up and even in my initial work environments, when I felt like I needed help or I didn't know the answer or I didn't have the right professional care around me, I never spoke up because that's a difficult conversation. You have to confront the difficulties with your colleagues or your family members if you have those difficult conversations. But I always say now that if you avoid difficult conversations, you are allowing yourself to have short term comfort over long term dysregulation. So if you address those difficult conversations now, you will be more regulated in the long term.
Hmm. That makes sense. And interestingly, I think that's what a lot of other people that I've spoken to also say. It's to not avoid difficult conversations and to actually talk it out. And the talking is actually a process of processing those emotions for yourself, whilst also getting a conversation started with people who are important to you. Really, really appreciate you mentioning that. Caitlin, what resource do you wish that you had back when you first started your job at BlackRock?
So it was actually a resource that BlackRock had available, and I only found out once my director really helped me out with my medical leave is I think a lot more corporations need to have mental health support for their employees, but not just have that as a partnership with companies and organizations, but really market that to their employees, make it a conversation as you onboard your employees. I later learned that BlackRock actually had available teletherapy care for their employees, but it was not something that I knew. I didn't have that on my phone, I didn't have it on my laptop. It was only during the moment of crisis that I found out that I could seek out a therapist covered by the health insurance provided by my employer. I think it's more about knowing what resources are available to you and seeking out professional care, even when you don't have a crisis at hand, even to prepare for any challenges that you'll have in the future.
Understood. And I'm quite curious to understand what your journey of learning about and trying to understand what professional support meant for you looked like. Because I know that a lot of people that I speak to, especially if they grow up in families where, perhaps they are the first ones to want to seek professional mental health support, there's almost a sense of not knowing where to start. So quite curious to hear about how that was like for you.
Yes, it was a really long journey because, first and foremost, even getting psychiatric medications, it was not something that my family was used to, that I was used to. So even knowing who to turn to, what psychiatrist was specialized in bipolar 1 versus depression versus other mental illnesses. Also, within the US ecosystem, the healthcare insurance industry is quite complicated, especially for just a normal employee that's trying to navigate all the pricing and the eligibility amongst providers with your insurance. So I remember trying to sign up for a psychiatrist. I had health insurance and I thought it would be covered by my insurance, but then getting a bill at the end of the period because I had to pay out of hand because it wasn't covered. So I learned a lot about navigating through the insurance world, navigating through psychiatrists that were specialized across different types of care. And then also on the therapy side, I started off, being really afraid to open up about what was happening in my life. I started off with one of the broader teletherapy platforms called BetterHelp. It was a great starting point. I was able to get initial care, but I started to realize that I wanted different modalities of therapy. I think talk therapy is one option, but there's a lot of different methods to deliver therapy that I only learned about through the process of seeking care.
Interesting. What other modalities of therapy that you've explored?
I've explored a ton. So, I started off with a type of therapy that is very popular called cognitive behavioral therapy. So, very much a talk therapy based modality. And then I also explored acceptance and commitment therapy, as well as EMDR, which is very much trauma based. I also tried an alternative modality called brain spotting, which is also focused on trauma, where a therapist holds a wand, navigates to a certain part of your brain, and then processes different traumas and emotions with you as an objective observer. Um, you know, a type of modality that a lot of people don't know, and it's still a very new modality. I've also experienced psychedelic guiding in an international setting where I had a guide navigate psilocybin experience with me, and then going through my experiences, all the way through to childhood as well. So some therapies that are more accepted and known in broader society, and then some modalities that are still finding its way to broader acceptance and understanding.
How did you come across the lesser known modalities of therapy?
I mean, one thing with me that I realized is I'm a person that talks to a lot of people and gets inspired by other people's journeys. And I learned about brain spotting from someone who also experienced this type of modality. She gave me some of the benefits that was outside of the traditional talk therapy. And because of her referral, I was able to try it myself and had a wonderful relationship with an integrative therapist that really helped me process a lot of trauma that was stuck in my body, and also some blocked memories that I wasn't able to uncover in traditional methods of therapy. And then with the psychedelic community, it's a very global community of folks that are talking about different modalities of care, different psychedelic therapeutics as well. And that was a lot just driven by curiosity. I knew that it was a very stigmatized subject. A lot of people might view it as controversial. But there are places beyond the legal landscape that you can do, as you can find guides that can help you navigate this type of modality, especially in international settings.
Interesting. And then, Caitlin, I know that, it sounds like you've had this longer journey, which really was catalyzed by the episodes that you had whilst working at BlackRock. Did you then go back to work at BlackRock, or did you immediately leave and try to navigate towards another type of role?
So, working at a company as globally recognized and successful as BlackRock, one of the best things with BlackRock is they had excellent medical leave. Coming out of this burnout and this experience, I thought, I needed to rest. I needed to have a break from my career. And I had a really wonderful director on my team that was there with me, through the process and helped me take that medical leave, not just immediately quit, but really take the time to find out what I needed to do next in terms of my clinical care, in terms of where I wanted to live, what I wanted to do, if I wanted to take a break or go back to BlackRock. And, the best thing about that is, though it was the catalyst that really made me make this change in my career, they really supported me in finding that next step.
I love that. Could you share a bit more about then, the motions that you went through to pivot in your career?
Yes. So, one of the things that I did initially coming out of BlackRock, as one ambitious type of person does, is I was thinking, how can I make this life experience into a startup? So instead of fully resting in the very beginning, I was, very fascinated and connected with entrepreneurial communities. At the time, there were some teletherapy companies that were emerging back in 2021, and I was thinking of really segmenting into youth teletherapy. So what I did, not having full-time startup experience, I dove into the industry myself. And it was actually quite healing for me because I was interviewing, teenagers that were experiencing mental health issues. I was talking to therapists that were trying to build out practices for youth. I was talking to insurance providers about some of the issues with the current system. And so, even if this startup failed, I didn't reach that next level of funding or didn't have, a long experience with this company because I was, very interested in the space and dove deep and spoke to a lot of people in the mental health industry outside of having a job, you know, through my own curiosity. I was able to get a lot of industry experience and kind of make a bet on what kinds of companies could actually grow in the ecosystem. So I ended up closing down that startup and joined a really fast growing teletherapy startup called Cerebral. It was a massive unicorn, became a unicorn in about 2 years. And I led growth and operations there and was also part of the insurance department. And like I mentioned, the US healthcare industry, especially with insurance, can be quite complicated. So I was working with very passionate team members, both in providing care to a wide range of mental illnesses, as well as having partnerships with these insurance providers, navigating the complicated aspects of billing, navigating new product launches in different types of illnesses as well. I took that, experience as a founder and really applied it to a bigger fast growing startup in this space.
You were really in the trenches of helping to scale access to good quality mental health care. I wanted to ask you, as someone who's also operated in that really high pressure startup environment, what is something that you learned about growth? And also, what is something that you learned about yourself over your time there?
A very interesting aspect about Cerebral was it was one of the fastest growing mental health startups in the industry. And I saw the impacts of venture capital on a startup. When you have venture funding, you have to scale to certain degrees. You're looking for certain revenue, for certain changes within the products and more with hiring and more. We ended up having some controversies within the company because we were scaling so quickly. We had hundreds of thousands of patients and within healthcare products, you're not just providing a service, you're providing healthcare. There is a patient at the end of the line that has an illness. There's a patient that might potentially have comorbidities with multiple illnesses. And so when you're building in healthcare, you're not mainly just seeking revenue, you are also providing the highest quality of care that you need. And so when I saw, these controversies at Cerebral, it really gave me this outlook that there is opportunity for mental health startups and brain health startups to seek venture funding. But as startups such as this start to scale, we need to really prioritize quality of care and the patient journey as much as growth. And I think that's something that you don't see in every industry where you don't have health at the end of the line and a life at the end of the line. I've really taken this experience here in my journey now as a venture capitalist because we speak to a lot of founders who want to grow and scale quickly, which is a very important component of the industry. But putting the patient, whoever you're treating at the end of the line, as the most important priority of your product is essential to whatever you build.
Is that something that can be lost along the way of trying to scale?
Yes, I definitely think it can be. There. I talk a lot about founder mental health within the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem, and the reality is there is always external pressures to be able to grow, to reach your next funding milestone, or to get that next 100,000 patients. And especially as you grow your company, you start to really delegate your experience and your operating experience to more people and start to be more separated from the end patient that is a part of your product. What I like to remind my founders that I speak to is that at the end of the day, within all these mental and brain health startups, we are here to change the way the illness is treated. And we really want to make that impact in the patient's life. Even if there is that pressure to make a certain revenue figure or to get to that next milestone, you always have to prioritize the patient.
And Caitlin, now you are a venture capitalist with PsyMed Ventures, where you invest into brain and also mental health companies. Not all venture capital investors have operational backgrounds, especially founder backgrounds. How do you think that your experience of having tried to build a company as a founder in the mental health space gives you an additional edge?
I think it's really, really useful because when you speak to a founder, they're often buttoned up. They have their numbers at hand, they have their product memorized back and forth. But the reality is, entrepreneurship is messy. When you're an early stage founder, like the pre seed and seed stage founders that we speak to, it's very exciting. You have a big mission and vision for the company that you're trying to build. But the reality is, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of a lot of the challenges you will face, a lot of the product changes that will happen in your company. There will be stress, there will be hiring, there will be firing, there will be a lot of opportunities for you to grow as a leader. And because of my experience, both as a founder and as an operator at a growth stage company, I think that I have that lived experience to both advise founders with the type of decisions they make, whether that's go to market decisions, product decisions, hiring decisions, and I also have a lot of empathy towards the founder that it's impossible to have all the answers. And that's why you should seek out advisors for support as well as your own teammates to be able to supplement a lot of the things that you don't know.
I'll ask you the flip side of the question, which is now that you have been a venture capitalist for a while, what is one thing that you have started to value more, which you perhaps didn't when you were a founder or an operator?
Yeah, I think one of the best things that I've really developed as a venture capital investor is the ability to quickly learn so many different industries and technologies very quickly. I think when you're working as an operator or a founder, you're really dialed into one specific company, one specific product. As a venture capital investor, you are essentially curious about so many different questions, technologies. You are able to ask questions to people that are even more experienced than you in whatever technology that you're interested in exploring. Whilst before I was more dialed in into one specific company as an investor, now if I'm interested in a topic, I simply reach out to as many people that are already dialed into that industry and start to ramp up my own understanding of the technology at hand.
And I guess the natural question would be what kind of innovations are you most excited about in the mental health space?
I'm incredibly excited about neurotechnology. So, neurotechnology can both be minimally invasive and invasive. We have a couple companies that we've invested in that are typically more minimally invasive. Part of the interesting aspects of neurotechnology is you can essentially use electricity to modulate parts of the brain that are affected by certain mental illnesses like treatment resistant depression, anxiety, and more. A lot of the patients that seek out neurotech, they've tried many medications, they've tried so many therapies, but nothing is working, hence the treatment resistant case. Neurotech offers a new modality to quiet down and modulate the parts of the brain that is affected by these mental illnesses. So, very excited about this broader industry.
Are there any companies that you want to give a shout out to?
Yes, so within the neurotech space, I'm very excited about a couple companies in our portfolio. So Motif Neurotech really focused on treatment-resistant depression. They've created a minimally invasive implant that modulates the part of the brain for depression. It was founded by an assistant professor in Rice University that spent over a decade working on miniaturizing the device that sends the electrical signals. And after a career in academia, was ready to commercialize his research and is now in early clinical trials for their company. And then another company that I'm very excited about in neurotech is called Neurode. They're very focused on improving attention for folks. So, ADHD is a mental illness that is specifically impacted by attention, but they also have hopes to widen their product for anyone who's seeking to have better attention. An interesting part about their product is they also allow brain scanning live. You're able to get a data set of your brain on a daily basis, as well as the stimulation that they provide to increase that attention.
Okay, wow, interesting. Are there any common challenges that founders that are trying to innovate in neurotech face?
I think the reality is the ecosystem is really early. It's really young, and there's a lot of uncertainty, especially for clinical neurotech in terms of the regulation to get a product approved and sold within, for example, the US market. And I can imagine also in the European market. If it's a consumer product, less so. But a lot of these products that really want to target clinical diagnoses, they really need to think through regulation and how to actually get that approval for the product to reach patients.
Understood. Caitlin, I want to take the conversation into the subjects that you have studied. So I know that at Harvard, I guess when you were doing your first degree, it was in economics and computer science. And now you are doing a master's at King's College London, more in neuroscience. What motivated you to apply to do that master's?
Yes. So back when I was in college, I was a very motivated student and took classes outside of my own course load. So took some psychology courses, took some neuroscience courses, some environmental science courses as well. I knew that I wanted to land in economics and computer science because I was interested in business, could really see the applications of those degrees for my career. But essentially, I decided to get a master's at King's College London, which is an excellent program for working professionals because I was really motivated by my time at PsyMed Ventures. I'd speak to founders who had PhDs in neuroscience, professors that spent their careers working in neuroscience. And as a venture capitalist, I was able to ask a lot of questions about their technologies, their products, but started to see where I wanted to gain a little bit of a deeper understanding of some core neuroscience foundational theories and a better understanding of the brain. I knew that I wanted to really dedicate my career to the mental and brain health industry. And so thought to go back to academia, really gain that foundational understanding, really get, those advanced modules into certain areas of neuroscience as well to be able to supplement my career in venture and then also in startups.
What advice would you give to other young professionals who are trying to stay relevant in industries where maybe AI tools are increasingly more commonly used?
I'd say the reality is similar to how AI is being increasingly used in every industry. All the information for every industry is also available online. You're able to search and even use these AI platforms to get up to speed with absolutely anything that you're curious about. And then the other aspect of this is really speak to people who are a few steps ahead of you. It might be someone who is in academia instead of startups, if someone who is a director whilst you're still starting out as an analyst, for example. You should be able to have these conversations to get a better understanding of what else you need to know to pursue that part of your career in your industry to stay as relevant and up to date as possible.
And for you, Caitlin, who are some people who have really inspired you as you've begun really delving into the space of mental health and now that you're starting your master's too?
So I'm going to use a cop out answer because it's people that I work with, my general partners, Greg Kubin and Matthias Serebrinsky. Even before I joined the firm, I actually followed their podcast and learned a lot about the psychedelic and mental health industry and the types of founders that they engaged with. What I really admire about the way they're navigating through this space is, they don't have a traditional neuroscience PhD background. They don't have a master's in neuroscience, but they really learned the industry by actually doing the work and investing in the space, by meeting founders, by staying as up to date with all the innovations, by creating events in the ecosystem, and by attending all these conferences. It really shows that you don't have to have an entire singular career. You can start off in one industry and learn another industry at any point of your career as well. So yes, they are definitely the people that I admire the most in the ecosystem.
And for any of our listeners who might be building in the mental health or brain health space, when should they reach out to you or your colleagues at PsyMed Ventures?
Yeah, so we're always excited to meet early stage founders. It can even just be an idea, and you don't have a product yet. We'd be very excited to brainstorm with you as well. My email is probably going to be shared with the listeners of this podcast. I'm always available to discuss. So whether or not you have a deck that's ready or you're still just thinking of an idea, we are excited to hear your product and hear about your company and really work with you to build a successful and sustainable company in the space.
What type of companies would PsyMed Ventures typically want to be investing in?
We have a general thesis in mental and brain health, but I like to explain that we invest in a wide range of technologies. We do both biotech companies, so pharmaceuticals, as well as tech companies. I mentioned neurotech earlier, med devices, infrastructure companies, care delivery companies, essentially anything that's changing the way mental and brain illness is treated. We are happy to work with the founder to get to those next, stages of their company. And because we are such a specialized firm, we focus really in this one niche. We also like to provide our network, our expertise in the industry so we can brainstorm with the founders on how to navigate their challenges, how to connect with the best people to hire for their next wave of growth as well. Anything related to mental and brain health, very excited to chat with founders building in the space.
What is PsyMed Ventures like to have on board as an investor?
What we like to explain to our founders is we like to see ourselves as an ecosystem builder. When you're a founder with us, for example, you can be featured in our in-house podcast to reach more potential customers, to reach more investors. We're also really connected with other tier one VCs, later stage VCs. So when you need help with fundraising and later rounds, we can really work with you through your pitch deck, really be that type of VC that you can be honest with. And, we are a mental and brain health VC. So we do know that founders experience their own mental health journeys throughout this experience. So we like to have full transparency with our founders. You don't have to be completely buttoned up when you speak to us. You can be honest and raw about your experience as you build your company. And we really believe that this honesty will allow founders to be as successful as possible when they reach the next phases of their journey.
Hmm. I think it's great that you're taking, founder health really seriously as well. I know that working in mental health, whether it's as a founder or even on the investment side, it can be really challenging and demanding. How do you personally protect your own mental well-being?
Yeah, so I'm studying my master's in neuroscience and I'm also working in ventures. So of course I have very long hours, but one of the more basic recommendations that I have for anyone who is quite ambitious is you always have to prioritize rest. Go down to the basics, sleep. I used to think that I was too busy to have sufficient sleep, but now every night I make sure that I have that 8 hours of sleep. And then I also incorporate a lot of physical movement. So I love exercise, running, going to the gym, and doing some of the more luxurious aspects of going to prioritize your physical health, such as going to a sauna, going to a spa. The body and the mind is so integrated and connected that when you prioritize one or the other, it really has an impact on the entire human body as well. So, incorporating exercise, incorporating sleep, and then, of course, I have a lot of gratitude towards the clinicians that I've worked with, the therapists, the psychiatrists that I meet, every single week, every single month. It's been a part of my livelihood that has allowed me to build a really sustainable career in a very demanding space.
I love that. And Caitlin, if you could go back and give a piece of advice to yourself when you first started at BlackRock, what would you say?
So I think when I reflect back on that period, I put a lot of pressure on myself because coming from an immigrant background, my family coming from the Philippines, and now having this salary from a wonderful company such as BlackRock, I was very afraid to take the leap and try to figure out something else. I had a lot of pressure to figure it out all on my own. I knew that burnout was very common with people in demanding industries, so I felt like I didn't need to ask for professional help. I think if I could turn back that time and go back to that period, I would really try to build holistic healthcare, not just one point, which is medication, for example, but really incorporate, community support from friends and family, therapy, as well as physical movement and diet. So, a broader overview of what a holistically healthy person could be, I would incorporate on a day to day basis rather than just try to figure it out all on my own and continue to work hours and hours on end.
What is the conversation around mental health in the Filipino communities that you're most engaged with in the US?
I think there's a broader conversation about mental health in the Filipino community in America. However, I talk to a lot of people with families in the Philippines and with immigrant backgrounds as well. And I think one of the hardest parts about seeking care is because it is a developing country, a lot of people don't have access to clinical care. A lot of people can't pay for therapy. Some of the immigrant families in the US don't have really substantial healthcare insurance to get the best types of psychiatrists or therapy, or they might not even know family members or friends that have gotten clinical care. It's very difficult to start seeking out care, to start addressing your mental health diagnosis. I think there's been some change. I often see some larger celebrities and influencers in the Filipino ecosystem starting to talk about mental health, but there's a long way to go because there is that connection to the stigmatized version of the mental health type of care that you can receive. So there's a lot of work to go, but I'm really optimistic that there's a lot of changes as well.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Caitlin, let me ask you the podcast staple, which is, what is one thing that you believe will allow more people to have better mental health?
I'm very optimistic about all the types of alternative modalities, frontier treatments that we're investing in at PsyMed. And, applied to a more personal basis, you have to realize that there's so many ways to address your mental health. There is talk therapy. That's one way to address your traumas and your diagnoses. But there's all these other treatments, clinical trials, academics that are navigating new spaces of ways to address mental illnesses, as well as companies that are emerging day by day. It excites me to see the number of companies that we are talking to innovating in a space that was once highly stigmatized and only left to uncover in a more private basis. Now there's a lot of opportunities to seek care outside of just the traditional therapy methods. So when you are navigating your mental illness, when you are navigating your mental health, know that with research, you can find the best level of care that can be provided to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. And just a bonus question, because I realize I have to ask you this. In the news and also on various social media platforms, there have been a lot of buzz recently about AI chatbots to whatever degree being used as therapists, whether it's unstructured, so through ChatGPT, or whether through what companies like Slingshot AI are trying to build. And I'm quite curious to understand, for you, what do you see the part of AI therapists to be? And what role do you think they'll play in mental health going forward?
I know that this space is quite controversial, but I'm also very optimistic about the space because, like I mentioned earlier, therapy and psychiatry can be very inaccessible for a large range of people. And also, if you have a mental health crisis in the middle of the night and your therapist is not available, this is where things like AI chatbots can really come in and prevent you from making certain decisions or from spiraling even further. I think that we really need to collaborate, in a multidisciplinary manner to create AI chatbots that are providing both clinically sound advice as well as to provide guardrails for any edge cases, any extreme cases of suicidality, of comorbidities amongst serious mental illnesses, for example. I think there's a lot of work to be done, not just on the founder basis of those building startups, but for clinical therapists and psychiatrists that want to provide advice to these types of companies, as well as regulators that want to ensure that these types of companies can really provide the best quality of care as possible. I think it's really early days. AI is developing so quickly. We have a lot to learn, but I'm very optimistic that we can use this to really democratize access to care.
Thank you for sharing your insights. I love that. Caitlin, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the Low to Grow podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Annie.
That's a wrap for today's episode of the Low to Grow podcast. If it resonated with you, leave a review and hit follow to help more people to find important conversations. Keep growing and see you next time.